1. Debora Green. Debora Green was a board-certified emergency physician in the Kansas City area, 44 years old. At the time of her arrest, a mother of 3, and to neighbors in Prairie Village the image of professional success. She had married cardiologist Michael Farrar, and the couple built a life that looked enviable from the outside, a large home in a quiet cul-de-sac, children involved in school, and activities, 2 doctors balancing demanding schedules. Friends and colleagues described Green as brilliant and driven. At home, though, the marriage had frayed. By the summer before the fire, her husband had moved out and filed for divorce, and the couple's personal turmoil began to eclipse the polished public image. Those months brought powerful pressures. Court records and contemporaneous reporting describe heavy drinking, unpredictable mood swings, and fights over custody and money. Green's husband had started a new relationship and was pressing forward with the divorce. Witnesses recounted that Green's behavior grew erratic and at times alarming. In one episode, she called him to say she was wandering the city, hoping someone would harm her. In another, she hid in the house to make him worry. Doctors struggled to explain his sudden debilitating illnesses that summer. Later, investigators and prosecutors concluded he had been covertly poisoned with ricin extracted from castor beans. The marriage, already in pieces, now sat on a fault line of fear, resentment, and escalating risk. In the early hours of late October, the family's Prairie Village home went up in flames. Green and her 10-year-old daughter Kate got out. Her 13-year-old son Timothy and 6-year-old daughter Kelly did not. The fire moved quickly through the structure, and despite the efforts of firefighters, the scene turned catastrophic. In the days after, Green told those around her that the blaze had been a terrible accident. But the wider timeline, her husband's mysterious illnesses, the acrimony of a collapsing marriage, the stressors of a home in upheaval cast a longer, darker shadow over what happened that night. A regional task force of arson specialists combed the scene. Their report concluded the fire was intentionally set, describing multiple areas of origin and patterns consistent with an ignitable liquid poured through parts of the house, including upstairs hallways that led towards the children's rooms. Laboratory testing detected compounds associated with accelerants. Separate forensic findings contradicted Green's account of how she encountered the fire. Detectives also recovered library records showing she had recently checked out materials on intrafamilial homicide and a novel found in her bedroom centered on children dying in a deliberately set house fire. Meanwhile, medical tests and interviews pointed back to the husband's illnesses being consistent with ricin exposure. Green was arrested in late November and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Timothy and Kelly, 2 counts of attempted murder for the poisoning of her husband and the endangerment of her surviving child, and 1 count of aggravated arson. A judge set bail at $3 million, reflecting the severity of the allegations and the risk factors prosecutors described. As pretrial motions proceeded, the state signaled it would seek the death penalty. Defense investigators reviewed the state's fire science and reported that the evidence against their client was formidable. In mid-April, Green entered an offered plea no contest, acknowledging that the state could present substantial evidence of her guilt while not admitting the intent alleged by prosecutors. In late May of that year, the court sentenced her to life in prison on 2 counts to run concurrently with no possibility of parole for 40 years, the hard 40 sentence in Kansas law, along with concurrent terms on the remaining counts. In the years that followed, Green sought to withdraw her plea, arguing that advances in fire investigation undermined the arson conclusion. She also pursued federal habeas relief and later challenged her sentence in state court. Each effort failed. Appellate judges noted that even accounting for evolving fire science, the case included abundant corroborating evidence beyond burn patterns and laboratory chemistry. Green remains incarcerated in Kansas and will not be eligible to seek parole until the mid-235 decade at the earliest. Psychological assessments in the court record painted a portrait of a highly intelligent physician under crushing personal stress, emotionally volatile, and drinking heavily, traits that do not excuse criminal acts but help explain the combustible mix of motive and opportunity. The most supported interpretations point to a blend of revenge and control during a bitter marital collapse, amplified by deteriorating mental health and the disinhibition that alcohol can bring. At sentencing, the court weighed those factors but returned to the core facts: 2 children were dead, a 3rd child had barely survived, and a husband had endured a prolonged clandestine poisoning. Whatever turmoil existed inside the home, the law required accountability for choices that turned a domestic crisis into irrevocable harm. The case of Debora Green stands as a stark warning. Professional stature and outward stability do not shield a family from the consequences of obsession, anger, and manipulation. The justice system's outcome, life imprisonment, with decades before even the possibility of parole, reflects the gravity of taking lives and shattering a family. A community lost 2 children who should have grown up. Siblings and parents carried grief that no sentence can repair. The psychological context matters only to help us understand how danger can grow in plain sight. It never reduces culpability. In this story, justice meant a hard acknowledgement of responsibility and a firm boundary set by the court. The lives lost deserved nothing less than that clarity and resolve. 2. Michelle Catherine Thier. Michelle Catherine Thier was a clinical psychologist in Fayetteville, North Carolina, 33 years old at the time of her arrest, married to Air Force Captain Frank Marty Thier, and known professionally as a bright counselor working toward full licensure. Friends saw a polished couple whose lives revolved around the military community and a growing therapy practice. But their marriage was strained by long separations and conflicting priorities. She worked in a private office alongside a supervising psychologist, and he rotated through demanding assignments. They had married young high school sweethearts who seemed destined for a steady life together. In private, the relationship frayed. Counseling sessions documented frustration and a widening emotional distance, and colleagues noticed that Michelle's public composure often masked turmoil at home. Pressures mounted over the year that preceded the crime. While her husband was away frequently, Michelle built a double life online and began an affair with an Army sergeant named John Diamond. Emails recovered later showed the relationship intensifying as her marriage buckled. The couple tried marital therapy and a trial separation, then a reconciliation that placed Michelle back under the same roof, while she told her employer she would end the affair. Instead, the conflict escalated. Digital records reflected contact between Michelle and Diamond, even as she and her husband appeared to patch things up. Prosecutors later described a pattern of manipulation and control, a secret romance colliding with a faltering marriage, a woman balancing 2 incompatible worlds, and a steady drift from resentment into planning. On the night of Sunday, December 17, 2000, the Thiers returned to Fayetteville from a holiday dinner with co-workers. According to her statement, Michelle asked to swing by her office to retrieve a reference book, leaving Marty waiting outside near the stairwell. In those same minutes, phone records showed Michelle placing a call to Diamond earlier in the evening. Investigators would argue it was a cue. Marty was ambushed and shot 5 times outside the office building, a swift attack that left no chance for help. Michelle told police she heard the shots ran out, found her husband down, and then hurried to a nearby video store to summon assistance because she had locked herself out. In the first days that followed, suspicion fixed on Diamond. Military investigators tied him to a handgun of the same model as the murder weapon and charged him with obstructing justice after he reported the gun stolen. A general court-martial later convicted him of murder and conspiracy and sentenced him to life without parole. The civilian investigation widened to Michelle. Detectives traced a deeper chain of communications and behavior: the strategic phone call from the restaurant, continuing contact with Diamond despite the supposed reconciliation, and computer materials and witness testimony that suggested preparation rather than panic. When a grand jury indicted Michelle in late spring 2002, she vanished. Marshals found her months later in South Florida, living under aliases, her hair color changed and her face altered through cosmetic procedures. In North Carolina, prosecutors built a circumstantial case that she had lured her husband to a predictable spot and coordinated with Diamond to lie in wait. At trial, jurors heard about the marriage's collapse, the affair's intensity, and pieces of corroborating evidence that taken together painted her as an architect rather than a bystander. After a nearly 3-month trial, the jury in early December 2004 found her guilty of first-degree murder by aiding and abetting and of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder and an additional term of more than 13 years for the conspiracy conviction. The state psychology board later revoked her license based on the felony verdict. She appealed, arguing insufficient evidence and trial errors. Appellate judges upheld the convictions. She remains incarcerated in North Carolina. The psychological portrait that emerges from court records is not cinematic, it is clinical. Michelle Thier appears as an intelligent, ambitious psychologist whose personal life collided with her professional vows. Expert testimony and records highlighted a marriage under heavy strain and a clandestine affair that brought desire and leverage in equal measure. The most supported explanation for motive blends control resentment and a calculated bid to escape a failing marriage without surrendering status or freedom. Diamond's role as the triggerman did not obscure the planning prosecutors attributed to Michelle the phone contact at critical moments, the orchestration of her husband's movements, and the flight that followed the indictment. Judges who reviewed the case emphasized that the mosaic of evidence, not any single dramatic item, supported the verdict. The story ends with an unambiguous moral reckoning. A husband, son, friend, and officer was killed on a quiet December night, and a family's future was stolen. Whatever emotional pressures shadowed this marriage, they explain nothing and excuse even less. The law answered with life imprisonment, a consequence meant to reflect the gravity of engineering another person's death. For the community, the case stands as a stark warning that charisma and professional polish can conceal profound danger. Justice here required patient investigation, careful trials, and a verdict that centers the victim and the harm done. That clarity, grounded in evidence and affirmed on review, is the least that Marty Thier and his loved ones deserve. 3. Amy Bishop. Amy Bishop, a Harvard-trained geneticist and neurobiologist, was 44 years old when her career at the University of Alabama in Huntsville imploded. A Massachusetts native who rose through elite programs, she presented as a driven researcher, a faculty member with grant ambitions, and a mother of 4. On campus, colleagues knew her as Professor Bishop. At home, she was Amy Bishop Anderson, married to James Anderson, a fellow scientist and entrepreneur. Her public image blended intellectual promise and family life. Yet, beneath that surface, the academic track had turned uncertain. She was working under the pressure of the tenure clock, the unforgiving system that decides whether a scholar's appointment becomes permanent or ends. That pressure became the defining stressor. The university had denied her tenure the previous spring, and by policy her employment would end after the academic year unless an appeal succeeded. Reporting and court records describe a period marked by grievance fear about the future, and comments from coworkers who had found her behavior volatile. Administrators fielded complaints about her teaching and lab management. She in turn filed discrimination allegations and searched for advocates to reverse the decision. Outside the lab, there were earlier red flags, now seen in a darker light. A long-ago fatal shooting of her younger brother in Massachusetts that authorities had once ruled accidental, and a mail bomb investigation years later in which she and her husband were questioned but never charged. None of these incidents explained what was about to happen in Huntsville, but together they sketched a life punctuated by crisis and dispute. On a Friday in mid-February of 2010, Bishop joined a routine biology department meeting. Faculty members took their seats around a conference table inside the Shelby Center. A short while into the agenda, she abruptly produced a handgun and began firing at colleagues seated nearby. 3 professors, Department Chair Gopi Podila Maria Raglan Davis and Adriel Johnson, were killed. 3 others were wounded but survived. The attack lasted moments. Witnesses later described confusion turned to terror and the desperate scramble of those who managed to force the shooter from the room and block the door. Police took Bishop into custody within minutes. She offered disjointed statements that night, and officers soon connected the outburst to the career crisis that had consumed her final months at the university. The criminal case moved quickly. Prosecutors charged Bishop with capital murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. As investigators reconstructed the scene and her recent history, national attention focused on the rarity of a female academic turning a department meeting into a site of mass violence. In Alabama, capital cases proceed under rules that still require a jury to hear a summary of the evidence even when a defendant pleads guilty. The families of those killed and wounded urged prosecutors not to pursue a death sentence. In early September of 2012, Bishop entered a guilty plea to capital murder and attempted murder, and later that month a jury formally found her guilty and the judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She waived most appeal rights as part of the plea. A later attempt to contest the agreement was rejected by Alabama's appellate court. Massachusetts authorities revisited the old shooting of her brother, but ultimately declined to pursue that matter in light of her Alabama sentence. She remains incarcerated at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. What motivated Amy Bishop has been discussed by reporters, colleagues, and mental health experts with caution rather than certainty. The most supported interpretation centers on grievance and catastrophic entitlement, a belief that the tenure denial was unjust, amplified by a history of interpersonal conflict and signs of mental instability. Profiles and filings describe episodes of angry, erratic conduct and writing that dwelled on themes of thwarted ambition. None of that diminishes agency. It frames a mindset in which career setback became existential threat, and colleagues, people who had taught with her, mentored students with her, and worked side by side, became targets. The courtroom resolution, shaped in part by victims' families who sought to avoid a capital trial, still delivered a severe outcome intended to protect the public and acknowledge the gravity of the harm. This case ends with a stark moral clarity. 3 scholars went to a meeting and did not come home. Their families lost loved ones. A department lost mentors. Students lost teachers whose work rippled far beyond any one laboratory or classroom. Professional stress, perceived slights, and mental health struggles are realities many people face, but they are never explanations for taking lives. The law answered with life without parole, a sentence that reflects the permanence of the loss and the community's need for safety and accountability. The lesson is sobering, but necessary. Institutions must take behavioral warning signs seriously, and none of us can allow anger and grievance to eclipse our basic duty to one another. Justice in this story means centering the victims, condemning the violence without qualification, and remembering the human cost behind the headlines. 4. Hsiu-Ying Lisa Tseng. Hsiu-Ying Lisa Tseng was an osteopathic physician specializing in internal medicine known in Rowland Heights, Los Angeles County as the doctor behind a busy storefront clinic she and her husband operated. In her mid-40s at the time of her conviction, she projected confidence and efficiency, short visits, quick prescriptions, a waiting room that churned. To many patients, she was the doctor who would see them without judgment and send them out the door with relief in a bottle. To neighbors, and some in the local medical community, her practice raised uneasy questions. Lines formed early. Word spread that people drove in from far beyond the neighborhood. Pharmacies began to balk. Behind the image of a tireless physician, a different portrait was taking shape, one of a clinic where potent opioids and sedatives were dispensed with alarming ease and thin documentation. The pressures and warnings mounted for years. Regulators and coroners notified Tseng that some of her patients had died shortly after filling prescriptions she wrote. Pharmacies refused to honor her scripts. Colleagues and staff observed agitated crowds and patients who appeared impaired. Investigators later described a pattern they said went well beyond negligence, perfunctory exams, failure to obtain past medical records, and an almost total disregard for the state database meant to flag doctor shopping. During the period when 9 patients linked to her practice died in less than 3 years, clinic revenues soared, and most visits were cash pay. Prosecutors argued greed was a driving force. Appellate judges would focus on something even more stark: continued prescribing in the face of known deaths, a course of conduct that in the law's language showed conscious disregard for life. The criminal case centered on 3 young men who died in 2009 after filling prescriptions from Tseng Nguyen, 28, Stephen Ogle, 24, and Joseph Rivero, 21, a college student who had traveled from out of state. None lived near Rowland Heights, a sign of how far her reputation had spread among people seeking pills. Families and friends told investigators there was no meaningful medical basis for the drug combinations they were given. The timeline is chilling without being graphic. After coroners called to report overdoses, Tseng kept writing high-risk combinations for other patients. When state and federal agents executed search warrants, they found evidence that patient charts had been altered after the fact and that key safeguards had been ignored. In October of 2015, a Los Angeles County jury convicted her of 3 counts of second-degree murder, along with nearly 24 other offenses tied to unlawful prescribing and fraud. In February of 2016, the court imposed a sentence of 30 years to life in state prison, with a directive that she must serve at least 3 decades before any parole consideration. The verdict was widely described as the first time in the United States that a physician was held criminally liable for murder in overdose deaths tied to prescriptions. On appeal, in December of 2018, a California court upheld the convictions, emphasizing evidence that Tseng knew patients had died and continued to prescribe powerful drugs in the same way. The psychology of the case was evaluated through a legal lens more than a clinical one. The state did not have to prove that Tseng intended anyone to die. It had to prove implied malice knowledge that her conduct endangered life, coupled with a conscious decision to proceed anyway. The appellate opinion found substantial evidence of that mindset across her practice: the out-of-area clientele, the cash-based volume, the truncated exams, the refusal to use tools designed to curb abuse, the falsified records once scrutiny arrived, and most of all, the continuation of high-risk prescribing after multiple patient deaths. The motive the jury accepted was not sudden rage or delusion, but sustained indifference for profit and speed. Families of the dead spoke of bright futures cut short. For them, accountability meant naming what happened as murder, not merely malpractice. Tseng surrendered her medical license and remains incarcerated in California. Her case taught in law and medical ethics courses as a warning about the deadly intersection of power, complacency, and drugs that can kill. This story ends with a clear moral verdict. A physician's first duty is to do no harm, especially when wielding medications that can end a life. Tseng's choices betrayed that duty, leaving parents without children and a community struggling to trust the care it receives. The justice system's response, a life sentence measured in decades before any chance of release, reflects the gravity of turning a clinic into a conduit for death. Economic stress, patient pressure, and busy schedules may explain why shortcuts start. They never explain why lives were lost. The lesson here is firm medical authority carries responsibility that cannot be pawned off on demand or profit. The victims, their families, and the profession itself deserved better, and the law answered to make that plain. 5. Lois June Farquharson. Dr. Lois June Farquharson worked as a staff psychiatrist at Philadelphia State Hospital, the vast and troubled institution long known as Byberry. In Philadelphia, she shared an apartment at Society Hill Towers with her romantic partner Gloria Burnett, who had been Farquharson's patient before becoming a hospital aide. Across the hall at Byberry sat the office of Dr. Leon Weingrad, an osteopathic physician who lived in the same apartment complex with his wife and young children. Colleagues later described a bitter atmosphere around this trio, professional rivalries mixed with personal tensions, and a relationship that many in that era judged harshly became fuel for conflict at work and at home. Farquharson's public image was that of a trained professional with a demanding caseload. Privately, by multiple accounts preserved in court records, she and Burnett were entangled in a volatile partnership, shadowed by jealousy and escalating disputes with Weingrad. Those tensions took recognizable shapes. Weingrad complained to hospital superiors about Farquharson's competence and openly criticized her relationship with Burnett. According to trial testimony, the animosity bled into petty harassment, and there were episodes of vandalism directed at Winegrad's car. Witnesses later said arguments between the women themselves were frequent. Prosecutors would portray Farquharson as consumed by jealousy, convinced that Burnett and Winegrad were having an affair. Farquharson denied this, telling police and the jury that any jealousy belonged to Burnett, not to her. Whatever its source, the pressure cooker was real, an adversarial colleague, a stigmatized romance scrutinized on and off the clock, and a pair of neighbors forced into daily proximity. In the days before the killing, Burnett testified that she used Farquharson's identification to purchase a handgun, saying the couple had discussed needing protection at home because of burglaries. That detail became central later as the case shifted from tragedy to theory of a plot. On a Sunday in late August of 1971, the conflict reached its worst outcome. In the garage area at Society Hill Towers, Burnett shot Leon Winegrad. The act ended a tense morning that, according to witness accounts and Burnett's testimony, included a visit to the doctor's apartment and a heated argument outside. No one disputed that Burnett pulled the trigger. The question that would define the case was whether Farquharson had orchestrated the killing. Burnett initially did not implicate her partner. More than a year passed before she accused Farquharson of inducing the murder, and the prosecution built its case around that claim. A bystander described seeing the argument moments before the shots. Investigators also introduced Farquharson's own statement to police, in which she acknowledged a conversation that morning about killing Winegrad and said that after trying to dissuade Burnett, she told her to do what she had to do. Farquharson later testified that she did not recall such a plan and insisted she had no agreement with Burnett to harm anyone. The trial lasted more than 3 weeks and hinged on credibility. The Commonwealth's theory was conspiracy, that Farquharson shared criminal intent and therefore bore responsibility for the act Burnett carried out. Defense attorneys attacked Burnett's shifting story and highlighted her recantations, but the jury believed the prosecution. In Philadelphia in 1974, they found Farquharson guilty of first-degree murder as the architect of the crime. The court imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. On appeal, Pennsylvania's highest court affirmed the verdict, noting Farquharson's own admissions as corroboration. A dissent argued that accomplice testimony remained too unreliable. Burnett, the admitted shooter, received a term of years sentence and was released after about 2 decades. Farquharson never wavered from her claim that she had not plotted the killing. Over the decades, she became one of Pennsylvania's longest-serving women in custody, a model prisoner by many accounts, and the subject of repeated but unsuccessful pleas for clemency. Her 6th petition was rejected years later. She died in state custody in early January of 2017, by then a frail nonagenarian who had spent more than 4 decades behind bars. What motivated Lois Farquharson has been discussed in measured terms by reporters and jurists rather than dramatists. The picture supported by the record is painfully ordinary jealousy and resentment, professional grievance and personal fear, a relationship in turmoil, and a neighborly feud that metastasized into a criminal agreement. The law treated her not as the hand that fired the gun, but as the mind that elected the outcome. The verdict rested on the idea of shared intent, not on gore or spectacle. However, one weighs the conflicts at Byberry or the social hostility the couple faced. None of it excuses a calculated decision that left a physician dead and a family bereaved. The case stands as a somber caution. When professional resentment and private obsession combine, the result can be irreversible harm. The justice system's condemnation in this case was severe and final for Farquharson, and nothing in the record diminishes the loss to Leon Winegrad's loved ones or the broader community that depended on doctors to heal rather than to harm.